Let's go ahead and start. Why not? So welcome everyone to the second biannual Book and Paper Group Graduate Symposium. Thank you all so much for coming. So this is a particularly exciting one because we have 4 speakers from 4 different continents tonight. So we have a lot of amazing diversity in the talks, both in their themes and also in the people's backgrounds and experience, and that's always a really fantastic thing to have. So I will just quickly give you a rundown of the schedule for tonight. So due to the international speakers, we're going to split the Q&A into 2 different groups, just to allow the people who are coming to us very early in the morning some time to then sit back and relax after they've finished their presentations. So we have the first 2 speakers, and then we'll have a live Q&A with the first 2. Then we'll have a 10-minute comfort break, just so everyone can gather themselves, and then we'll have the last 2 speakers and the final round of Q&A. So yeah, be sure to ask questions if you have any. I hope that you'll all enjoy the symposium. So I will now let the first speaker get up their presentation. So the first speaker today is Zaffer, who is joining us from Hong Kong, which is amazing. Zaffer received a BA in 2014 and a MFA in 2017 from the Fine Arts Department of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and specialized in ink painting. Zaffer learned about traditional Chinese mounting techniques since she engaged in the creation of these ink art pieces. In order to have a comprehensive understanding of conservation, she then pursued further studies at the Graduate Institute of Conservation of Cultural Relics and Museology in the Tainan National University of the Arts. So Zaffer, if you would like to take it away with your presentation.
Sure. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Zaffer, and I'm happy to share with you my thesis topic, research on the aging and removal properties of seaweed adhesive, Shi Hua Cai, applied to traditional Asian mounting. For today's presentations is divided into 5 parts. I'll begin with research motives and purpose, then research method, and move on to seaweed genus identifications, experiment and finding, and finish with conclusion. Shi Hua Cai in Cantonese, Set Fa Choi, is a kind of seaweed used in Hong Kong and Guangdong, China as traditional mounting adhesive. We cook the seaweed into paste and mix it with starch paste. The ratio is 1:1 for new paintings and 2:1 for old paintings. The common usage are backing and facing. Comparing to the starch paste, the mixed paste is relatively easy to remove, making the remounting process easier. And seaweed mucilage such as agar and lolly belongs to the class Rhodophyceae, so-called the red seaweed. And Shi Hua Cai also belongs to the same class, but the relative information is inadequate, and that's why I started the research. And there are 3 research purposes. First, I want to know the species of Shi Hua Cai. Second, the aging properties of the paste. And third, the removability of the paste. I've used 3 methods to identify the species of Shi Hua Cai. Method including gelling properties, DNA extractions, and physical appearance. And I've also did experiment on folding endurance, viscosity, pH value, and FTIR analysis to examine the aging properties of the paste. The removability of the paste is conducted by measuring the conductivities, weight, color differences of the paste-coated filter paper before and after washing. Shi Hua Cai is easily confusing with genelium, as the Chinese name of them are exactly the same, but Shi Hua Cai belongs to genelium. When you heat the seaweed in the water, genelium is more resistant to high temperature. Unlike Shi Hua Cai, the body of the seaweed dissolves into fluid. and the mucilage of Genidium form rigid gel when temperature cools down. The mucilage of Shi Hua Cai remain liquid form in room temperature. The phycocolloid of Genidium is agar, and Shi Hua Cai produce carrageenan. Therefore, the word Shi Hua Cai should be a common name used among traditional mounters rather than a scientific name. Eucheuma and Copperficus are the most common species to produce carrageenan, and other seaweed species like Fuloli are also under Gigatenalis, and that somehow explains the similar usage of Fuloli and Shi Hua Cai in Asian mounting. Unfortunately, the DNA extraction is not successful. There's no obvious electrophoretic band, but only a fragment you can see in the agarose. It's because Shi Hua Cai are always sold in dry form, and some of the DNA is destroyed by sun drying and washing. Therefore, fresh frozen samples is suggested for DNA extractions, and possible countries of origin should be China, Malaysia, or Indonesia. So the last resort to identify the seaweed is from physical appearance. And you can see Genidium had a feather-like branches, and Shi Hua Cai had a jigger-like branches, and they are bigger in size. The scientific name of Shi Hua Cai should be Eucheuma denticulatum. The mucilage of Eucheuma will melt into paste-like texture that you can brush on shun paper, while the mucilage of Genidium form rigid gel that are useful in conservation treatment. And these are the photos of other species used by different mounters, and the common features of them are all belongs to Gigatenalis, and they all produce carrageenan. I'll move on to the experiment. I have two types of Shi Hua Cai named A and B. B had lighter color as it had been washed for several times. I applied the solutions on filter paper and sun paper by using coating machine and brushes. Then the paper samples goes to 28 days UV aging or heat and humidity aging. For folding endurance experiments, I divided the paper samples into 4 groups. Sample names H stand for heat and humidity aging group, and U for UV aging, F for filter paper, and X for sun paper. The HF group had the highest folding endurance value, and the UX group had the lowest value. The paste paper samples had higher folding endurance than a control paper sample after aging, and the value improved with increasing paste concentrations. UV aging had a more significant impact on the paper fibers than the heat and humidity aging, resulting lower folding endurance levels in general. For viscosity and pH value experiments, I stored the paste A and B separately in cold and hot environment for 28 days. The viscosity and pH values of the paste dropped dramatically in hot environment. Polymer easily deteriorated at high temperature. As you can see in the pictures, the color and appearance of the same paste look so different under the 2 temperatures. Viscosity and pH values became relatively steady in cold environment from day 14. So to maintain shelf life, the paste is better stored at low temperature. For FTIR analysis, paste A and B had similar spectrum as the Lotter carrageenan, especially in the OH and H2O deformation band. Paste A and B spectrum didn't have obvious change. The chemical structures seemed stable under cold environment within 14 days. In the removability test, I pasted the filter paper using coating machine and marking down the original values of conductivity, weight, and color differences of the filter paper. Then the paper sample is soaked and rinsed by water for 3 times. The conductivities of paste B filter paper dropped from 17.5 to 1.2, very close to the conductivities of water. And the paper samples that achieved greater drop in conductivities also had a greater loss in weight. And that shows that Shi Hua Cai paste can be partly removed by water. As most of the paste are removed after washing, the paste B filter paper NBS values is relatively lower. Paste A made a slightly greater color difference than B, but the two pastes only make trade color differences on filter paper after washing. To conclude, Shi Hua Cai had been mistakenly referred to Genidium species because of similar Chinese name, now determined to be Ichuma species, and other species under Gigatonales, such as Capophycus and Cordus, can also use as adhesive. Shi Hua Cai paste improved the folding endurance of filter paper and soot paper, and paper samples under UV aging became yellowish and exhibit weaker paper strength. Shi Hua Cai paste, similar to Lotta carrageenan, is better stored in low temperature. High temperature accelerate deteriorations of the paste. Removability test shows that Shi Hua Cai paste applied on paper can be dissolved or partly removed by water, only making trade color differences on filter paper. And that's all of my sharing. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zaffer. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to our second speaker of the evening, Elizabeth Gralton. Elizabeth is a final year student at the University of Melbourne's Master of Cultural Materials Conservation, and she's chosen to specialise in paper conservation. Yeah, Elizabeth, if you'd like to take it away, thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. I hope you can all see my screen now.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. So this talk represents part of the research I did for my minor thesis, which is a component of the Masters of Cultural Materials Conservation at the University of Melbourne. I was initially planning to do a practical experiment based on Delaware solutions and agarose gel in paper conservation treatments, but due to the interminable lockdowns that we've experienced in Melbourne, access to labs was just too unpredictable in the end. So unfortunately, I had to retreat to a project which was essentially an extended literature review of these topics. Given the time restraints for this talk, however, I'm going to limit myself to discussing some of the things I found out about chelating agents, and I'm going to leave out the agarose gel side of things. So what do I mean by Delaware solutions? The Delaware solutions is a name used in Melbourne, but I'm not quite sure how widespread this terminology is. For a toolkit of aqueous solutions that were presented as part of a series of workshops run by Richard Walbers from the University of Delaware. The solutions are labelled A to F, and they contain chelating agents, either citric acid, EDTA, or DTPA, and buffers. They're pH adjusted using sodium hydroxide and conductivity adjusted to match the object being treated. I'm not sure how widespread the use of this series of solutions is in Australia and elsewhere, but I do know that they're being used in institutions in Melbourne, notably the State Library of Victoria, and we are being taught the use of them in the conservation course at Melbourne Uni. Unfortunately, however, the increasing use of these solutions is not at the moment supported by accessible and clear resources for students and conservators. And there's certainly no literature that refers directly to this toolkit of solutions as Delaware solutions. And the literature on chelators for paper treatments more broadly remains a little bit contradictory. When I was doing a treatment of a poster using some of these solutions, writing a properly referenced report as required by an academic assignment was difficult, as there's not a whole lot out there. So for example, two of the go-to resources for conservation students, the AIC Book and Paper Wiki and the Paper and Water textbook by Bannock and Burukul, both actually discourage the use of chelators. So the AIC book and paper wiki on this topic still has its original text from the 1990s, which suggests that the use of chelating agents for paper conservation is relatively rare because of the perceived risk that some reagents could remain bound in the paper matrix. The paper and water textbook barely mentions chelators at all, except in the contribution by Vincent Daniels, who suggests that paper conservators are reluctant to use them for fear that they'll remove beneficial calcium and magnesium from the paper. It's not that difficult to look up the basics of how chelators work. So just as a reminder, a chelator has several functional groups, which you can see here in this diagram of EDTA, which when they're ionized, trap a metal ion in solution or complex it and prevent it from participating in further reactions. But because of the relative paucity of resources on chelators and paper conservation, there are sort of areas of confusion that certainly student conservators struggle to find clear answers to when they're using these Delaware solutions. So for example, why and when should I use chelators to clean paper? What is the significance of conductivity? Does it matter if chelators stay in the paper? These are questions that I and fellow students were asking and not necessarily finding really clear answers to. So it can be hard to find in the literature an answer for how chelators work to clean dirty paper. Most of the resources or articles focus on the use of chelators to remove damaging metals, particularly copper and iron, to treat foxing, to stabilize documents containing iron gall ink. And this doesn't always help us understand how chelators help to remove discoloration from paper. More recently, there's been some hints that calcium ions play a role in cementing dirt to paper. So for example, Antoinette Douane and Chris Stavroudis in a relatively recent paper hypothesized that calcium and magnesium can form a bridge between cellulose fibers and layers of grime or oxidized degradation products. And these ions firmly adhere unwanted substances to paper, preventing them from being washed away by water alone. But when these bridging ions are trapped by chelators, the unwanted materials are freed and can be washed away. So this idea is perhaps a little bit paradoxical for paper conservators who are conditioned to seeing calcium as a beneficial substance for paper, because as we saw, the removal of calcium is a reason cited for not using chelating agents. So this emphasizes, I think, the need to have a plan for reintroducing calcium after a washing treatment if chelators are being used. Another confusing characteristic of these Delaware solutions is their focus on conductivity, which in the simplest terms is about matching the ionic concentration of the washing solution with the ionic concentration of the object being washed. And the reason to do this is to prevent a significant migration of ionic substances from one place to another, which in turn can lead to shrinking or swelling of materials, which can lead to damage. But when most of the literature on conductivity and solutions relates to paintings, it can be difficult for paper conservators to find a clear answer on whether a solution of higher or lower ionic content will cause fiber swelling. So it's it's established that when paintings are clean, a solution with a higher ionic content will cause the paint film to swell as ions move from areas of higher concentration to lower through diffusion. But in paper washing, the process is complicated by the existence of cell walls in paper fibers, which act as semi-permeable membranes in an aqueous solution and therefore subject to osmotic forces. So instead of ions moving, the water is moving across the membrane to dilute an area of higher concentration. So it's a wash solution with a significantly lower ionic content than the paper that is likely to cause swelling of paper fibers. And this is generally speaking the opposite when we're talking about paint films. the basic premise remains the same. Keep the ionic concentration similar, but it's worth for paper conservators to keep in mind this added complication of the plant cell wall. You'll remember that the ASE Book and Paper Wiki cited the fear of residues remaining in the paper as a reason to not use chelators. And I was particularly interested in this question because I noticed the worsening of a stain in a poster that I washed after not properly clearing a solution containing chelators. And when I went to write this up for my assignment, it again found that there's not a whole lot of research on this topic. Jana Kola et al. In an article on stabilizing paper containing iron gall ink suggests, for example, that a complex of EDTA and iron 3 can continue to catalyze the Fenton reaction, which causes cellulose oxidation. Some students at Melbourne Uni have done preliminary studies suggesting that a clearance step after washing in Delaware solutions is beneficial in terms of minimizing degradation as the paper ages. And another study by Bryony Pemberton and Libby Meltzer found that failure to rinse after treatment with chelators led to reduced uptake of calcium, presumably because the remaining chelator molecules were complexing with calcium ions and preventing their deposit into the paper. So we don't know very much, but in summary, clearance of chelators is likely to be important, which paper conservators probably already intuitively know, but it's important to consider the reintroduction of calcium for paper strength afterwards. So the Delaware solutions provide a good toolkit of solutions for practicing conservators who are not maybe conservation scientists themselves. But I took away sort of 3 key things from this review exercise. The first is that resources that clearly explain principles behind Delaware solutions for students of paper conservation are currently lacking, and it would be nice to be able to collate some of the disparate resources in a more synthesized way. Secondly, along with damaging transition metals such as iron and copper, we're starting to see calcium emerging as more of a key character in this treatment technique for paper. So it's an interesting protagonist, I think, as it is both playing a negative role of adhering on dirt, but it's providing paper strength. So it needs to be considered quite carefully. And lastly, something that paper conservators already know is that no matter how well you understand, say, preferential chelation and formation constants at different pHs, which I haven't even got into today, I'm not a chemist, you can't know everything about the object you're dealing with and all the mysterious substances that it may or may not contain. So while a theoretical foundation is important, it is at its most valuable when combined with empirical observations of the conservator at the bench. So thank you for bearing with me. I know that this has not been as interesting as seaweed and soot and blood, but if anyone has had experience using these solutions or chelators in general, I'd love to hear from you. So either in the comments afterwards or email me. I'd love to know what you've done. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It was interesting to put yourself down. Okay, great. So I guess now that we've had those 2 presentations, we'll move on to the Q&A portion of the evening for Zaffer and Elizabeth. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A function that's along the little the bottom. But before I move on to other people's, I have some questions that I'd like to ask, and I get to say that first because I have the mic. So Zaffer, I was wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit more about how the adhesive is traditionally used and applied in art. Yeah, just a little bit more about the kind of historical background of its usage as an adhesive would be really great.
And we mainly, Okay, we mainly use it in the traditional mounting. And why we are using Shi Hua Cai is because it's a rather easily we can obtain near the coastal area, such as Hong Kong or Guangdong, China. And the best things about the seaweed is because when you use with starch paste for the mounting, sometimes it makes the hanging scroll stiffer. The stiffness of the paper increased, but if you add a little bit of the Shi Hua Cai paste into the with starch paste, it will make the paper relatively softer. So when you roll the hanging scroll, less creases will be made.
Great, that's amazing. And you actually you have some with you, don't you? Would you like to show
Oh
everyone
yeah,
what it looks like?
I can show it to you guys. Oops, it looks like this way. Actually, it's a food product for normal people. And you can see they're always sold in dry form. And this is the genadium I mentioned before that made agar. And this is the Shi Hua Cai. So you see they more or less the same in the package.
Oh, amazing.
And you can see the name of it is written in Mandarin. 海燕窝 is not correct. So sometimes fishermen or sailors, they have their nickname for the seaweed, and sometimes it's confusing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, especially I can see why they'd be so easily mixed up as well when you're not, paying particular attention. If you're using it for food, then it, I suppose it's the specific species wouldn't matter so much, so things get confused. But yeah, really fascinating. And Elizabeth, I wanted to ask actually, so talking about chelating agents, would you know how chelating agents might affect metal-based pigments or paints or media if you were to use those on an artwork?
This is something, a caveat that I actually had in my thesis was that I didn't even go there. So I haven't looked into, I was just really concentrating on the kind of paper substrate side of things and not kind of delving into the various issues that would come up with pigments and inks and what have you. So I would say that yes, one would proceed with caution, but I wouldn't want to say anything more kind of authoritative than that. But yeah, it's a really good question, and definitely would need to be looked into before you dipped anything in.
Yeah. It's just so interesting how you're saying that there is such a paucity of literature out there specifically for its usage in paper conservation. So yeah,
there's plenty of sort of case studies where people use chelating agents, but I think what certainly from a student perspective, as a paper conservation student perspective, it's hard to find the sorts of resources that really explain how to make these different choices and when to use them and what's actually going on, because things like pH that you use them that really affect what substances they will chelate, and I think hopefully as they use more, we'll have some kind of more kind of accessible resources that allow people who don't necessarily have a really high level of chemistry to understand, because that's something I struggled with a bit, because I did high school chemistry, but I'm not by no means an expert, and so I was having to get my head around acid dissociation constants and all of these sorts of things, which it's tricky, and it sort of can be a bit alienating, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I sympathize with that. I was definitely an art student, not a chemistry student. Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. Zaffer, Cassandra has asked, would Shi Hua Cai be a good substitute for wheat starch paste if more flexibility is required? They've said that when they've been lining book spines, wheat paste tends to crack.
And I don't think Shi Hua Cai can be a substitute of wheat starch paste because, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint, we use the ratio 1:1 in new painting. So you need an amount of wheat starch paste because the viscosities of the Shi Hua Cai is relatively lower than the wheat starch paste. The reason why we add the Shi Hua Cai paste into wheat starch paste for mounting is because we want the hanging rope to be as flexible as it can, because sometimes the wheat starch paste is just too strong that it may affect the paper. And when you roll the scroll and creases, you create some creases when you roll the hanging scroll. So, but I do think that you can try using it, but not on artifacts. You can do some small samples and you can really know how sticky it is. Actually, it is not sticky at all because why we're using it is we want to reduce the strength and reduce the viscosity of the wheat starch paste in mounting.
Oh, fascinating. So you could maybe play around with using different ratios.
Yes, definitely. So, so when we are dealing with the old paintings, we increase the ratio of the Shi Hua Cai paste to make the gel strength of the paste not too strong for the old painting because we're afraid that it will make a big impact on the paper.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see. There's a few things in the chat for you, Elizabeth, and yeah, a couple of pointers as well. It seems that you've really opened up an area of conversation that we all really need, which is fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure you can see it in the Q&A section that Lydia's pointed out, the Iron Gall ink symposium that looks at the use of calcium phthalate in the treatment of iron gall ink. So there you go, some extra workload for you. There's another question for you here, Zaffer, from Beth. It said, thank you for the interesting talks. Could you elaborate on how the identification of the species of Sui Ying Zaffer could potentially impact authentication or conservation treatment decisions?
Oh, it's really, really important to identify the species of Shi Hua Cai because I'm seeing literature or research that are using the word Shi Hua Cai, but without specified listing what kind of species they're using. Because Shi Hua Cai in Chinese, it may means genedium, which make agar. And maybe is related to, you refer to Shi Hua Cai, and you can see the phycocolor of them is totally different. You cannot like spread gel using brushes on sandpaper. So I think it's really important for people who wish to write about seaweed to tell the others what kinds of species they're using and give the scientific name of the seaweed as a reference so that when people want to do the same experiments, they can have the correct type of seaweed to do the same experiment.
Yeah, amazing. And there's another question for you, Elizabeth, asking sorry, I had the question, but it's disappeared. Sorry, give me 1 second.
I can't see any for me.
Yeah, it's disappeared. But I did see it briefly. I don't know who sent it in, but it was asking about the practical component in the lab. If you were if you were able theoretically to have done that practical component, what would that have looked like, and how would have that informed your research?
So the question that I originally, or that one of my supervisors originally kind of wanted to know about was if you apply one of these Delaware solutions to an object in an agarose gel form rather than immersing the object, you're obviously going to want to clear the solution by using a gel, because if you couldn't immerse it originally, you're not going to want to immerse it to rinse it. And she wanted to do some experiments to see the sort of effectiveness of clearing with an agarose gel as opposed to clearing, by immersion. And then we're going to do some sort of accelerated aging tests to see if there was a difference, and if that clearing using the gel was going to be was actually effective. And in a way, I'm glad. I was really disappointed that I couldn't do that practical, just because getting into the labs was too much of a hassle. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it was sort of good to be forced to do this really kind of more thorough literature search that I ended up doing. So, maybe one day in the future I'll have the opportunity to actually do the practical study, or maybe someone else will be able to, and it would be nice to see how they go. But yeah, as we're increasingly using agarose gels to apply some of these things, it's good to know whether you can then use that same method to clear the treatment afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. A topic for a PhD maybe after you finish your master's.
Yeah, no thanks.
I also wanted to ask as well, so you're saying agarose, is that, would you exclusively use the agarose gel? Would you not consider using gelin or agar or?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. And I don't know whether it's just a sort of, in Australia we can tend to be a bit isolated sometimes, and I get the feeling that gelin gum is used a lot more everywhere else. And one of my fellow students was doing some studies looking at enzymes in gelin gum. But yeah, it's not something that I've used that seems to get used a lot. And it's something, again, that I did say in my thesis, is that that's definitely something we should be looking into more, because it is, if nothing else, more affordable than the kind of really highly refined agarose. So yeah, I would say that at the moment, in my experience, and I can't speak for conservators in Australia more generally, but it seems that agarose is more often being used than gelin.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just find that so I prefer to use gelin because I find that it releases the moisture less quickly, like it retains. Yeah. So I wonder if maybe that would be something interesting to explore in terms of the clearing aspect of it. If it leaked, if it leached less, would it then perhaps have less clearing concerns if it was in gelin?
Yeah, I know that's a really interesting question, and you're just adding more things to look at here.
Sorry. Well, let's maybe call it an end to the Q&A here, in case you end up having to apply for that PhD. So it's now 20 to 7. Yeah. So should we have a quick 10-minute break just to get some water and whatever, and then we will come back for our last two speakers. Thank you both so much for the Q&A element. That was really great.
Thank you.
For the questions.
Okay, great. So we will now start back up again with our third speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Heidi Forsyth, is currently completing her MA in Conservation of Fine Art on Paper at Northumbria University. She attained her BDes in illustration in 2018 from Alberta College of Art and Design and worked as a freelance illustrator and private art instructor before pursuing her studies in conservation. We'd like to just get the video up now and she'll take it away.
Hello, my name is Heidi Forsyth. I'm currently completing my Master's in Conservation of Fine Art on Paper at Northumbria University. My dissertation focuses on applying forensics research to the identification and conservation of blood on paper. Today I will be discussing the biology and visual indicators of dried blood, potential tests used in forensics to identify blood that could be applied to conservation, things to consider when observing paper objects containing blood, and lastly, how I've applied this research to one of my case studies. Whole blood contains two main components, the solid cellular portion, which consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and the liquid plasma in which the cells are suspended, which is made up of water and dissolved materials such as antibodies, enzymes, and hormones. The component we mostly need to know about is hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is a protein found in red blood cells. Within the hemoglobin molecule are non-covalently bound heme groups that contain an iron atom. This iron atom can form reversible bonds with oxygen, which is why blood can transport and deposit oxygen throughout our body. A visual characteristic to look for in potential blood stains is obviously the color. When those iron atoms in hemoglobin are bonded to oxygen, blood will generally appear bright red in color. This is why once blood leaves our body and is oxygenated by the ambient environment, it appears that typical bright red. As blood stains age and the hemoglobin degrades into methemoglobin and hemochrome, it turns brown in color. However, dilute or thin blood can sometimes appear yellowish in color due to the lower heme concentration. Due to various health reasons, blood can, of course, appear in a variety of hues, but generally speaking, we're looking for those brownish and reddish colors. Another key characteristic of dried blood is surface cracking, as seen in the two images on the left. As the water in the blood dries, cracks in the surface will begin to form. Like other liquids that contain dispersed solids, blood will exhibit what is known as a coffee stain effect or a contact line pinning effect upon drying. Capillary flow during drying will cause the dispersed material to concentrate towards the edges, causing a darker ring along the edges of the stain. Sometimes around that ring, though, you can see a yellowish halo, which can be caused either by a thinner concentration of heme pigments or serum separation, depending on factors such as how the blood was applied, the amount of blood, how long it's been ex vivo, whether it's whole blood, etc. Lastly, dried blood has high absorbency qualities and will appear quite dark under UV, visible, and IR lighting. So we know what blood looks like. Still, it's not uncommon for it to be confused with artist materials because, as you're probably already thinking, there are artist materials that have very similar qualities to the ones I just listed. In fact, there are documented cases of iron gall ink and mold being misidentified as blood. In addition, another one of blood's main characteristics is its iron content, and that isn't a very useful indicator as many artist materials, such as most earth pigments, contain iron, making methods such as XRF and iron detection strips not very helpful. Therefore, rather than identifying iron as a possible indicator of blood, forensic scientists utilize the peroxidase activity of hemoglobin and immunology to test for blood. While technologies such as high-performance liquid chromatography and atomic force microscopy can be conclusive in identifying blood, the equipment is costly, and it requires specialists to operate them and interpret the data. Thus, these options are not accessible to many conservators. When determining which blood test would be most applicable to conservation, I looked for the following criteria: extensive validation and sensitivity studies, ease of use, cost-effectiveness, quickness of results, shelf life, and commercial availability. There are two categories of in situ tests employed by forensic scientists: presumptive and confirmatory. Presumptive tests are highly sensitive, but as their name suggests, are only used to indicate whether something is likely blood but cannot confirm it. As they generally rely on the peroxidase reactions of hemoglobin, false positives may occur from some vegetable and metal matter. Though presumptive blood tests cannot ensure whether a blood stain is indeed blood, they are still beneficial. They could be thought of as a tool such as UV photography, allowing conservators to make more informed inferences on materials and subsequently more informed treatments. The first of the presumptive tests I'm going to discuss are the Kastle-Myers and leukomalachite green test. These tests indicate the presence of hemoglobin through a catalyzed color change triggered by the peroxidase activity of heme. Both tests involve taking a small sample from the stain that is presumed to be blood and administering chemicals that induce color change when hemoglobin is present. The required sample is obtained with a cotton swab saturated with ethanol or scraped with a point formed by folding a small circular sheet of filter paper in half twice. A drop of color indicator followed by a drop of hydrogen peroxide, or other oxidant, is added to the swab or paper sample. If hemoglobin is present, it will catalyze the oxidation of hydrogen peroxide. The oxidation products will interact with the color indicator, inducing a color change. Phenolphthalein is used as the color indicator for the Kastle-Myers test, and it will turn a bright pink when oxidized. As the name suggests, leucomalachite is used as the color indicator for the leucomalachite green test, and will turn blue-green when oxidized in the presence of hemoglobin. These tests are extremely sensitive, cost-effective, commercially available, and have a 6-month shelf life from opening. Unfortunately, they aren't human-specific, so blood from other animals will incite a reaction. Another presumptive test that could be useful in paper conservation is hemostix. It is one of the most widely used and tested methods for indicating blood in archaeology and forensics. Initially developed to detect occult blood in urine, the test was later adopted into forensics and subsequently applied to archaeology by Thomas H. Loy in the 1980s in his research to detect residual blood from the surfaces of prehistoric tools found in Western Canada. Hemostix is a commercially available hemoglobin chemical reagent test strip, which contains all the blood reagent materials at the coated tip of the stick, and therefore does not require the multi-step process needed for the KM or LMG tests. The strip is rubbed across a moistened stain or swab containing a sample, and will turn green if hemoglobin is detected. The use of this test was criticized due to its tendency for false positives when in contact with peroxides and pseudoperoxidases found in plant, fungal, and bacterial matter, as well as some metals. However, further validation studies using EDTA as a chelating agent has significantly reduced this problem. It is easy to use, cost-effective, and commercially available like the previous tests. However, the KM and LMG tests are reported to be more sensitive than hemostix, and it has a 6-month shelf life for manufacturing rather than 6 months from opening. The second type of testing is termed confirmative testing because of the ability to confirm the presence of blood. Generally, these tests need to be performed in the lab and use equipment such as microscopes. However, the hexagon OBTI can be completed in situ, which is why I chose it as a viable option. Hexagon OBTI is an immunochromatographic one-step test that was developed for the detection of fecal occult blood. A small sample, presumed to be human blood, is placed in the tube with chemical reagents, then a few drops are applied to the testing strip. If the blood stain being tested is of human origin, the human hemoglobin will react with the anti-human hemoglobin antibodies in the hexagon OBTI test, and both lines will appear on the test to indicate a positive result. While it is very straightforward and has quick results, it does cost a bit more than the other tests and has a lower sensitivity than the presumptive tests. Conservation, museum, and heritage studies are at an exciting point in history. Questions and discussions challenging colonialist methodologies and perspectives, inclusivity, and ethics within our industry are at their peak. Within that rhetoric is the handling of human remains within collections, and I believe blood should be included in those discussions. The Human Tissue Authority has outlined a list of materials on their website considered relevant material as defined by the Section 53 of the Human Tissue Act. This section describes relevant material as material other than gametes, which consists of or includes human cells, thereby including blood as human tissue. The context in which a potential blood stain has occurred on paper should be an essential consideration in our treatment, storage, and display decisions. I have outlined the following categories that I feel are important to consider: intent, consent, and owner identification. As the name implies, intentional blood stains refer to objects in which the blood was purposefully applied to paper. Within this lies the consideration of consent from the person from whom the blood was taken. An example of intentional blood stains with consent is the practice of blood writing in Buddhism. This spiritual practice involves a performer draining their own blood to use as ink to copy Buddhist scriptures. Other examples include this painting by Vincent Castiglia, who paints exclusively in his own blood, and the series by Portia Munson, created by pressing sheets of paper between her legs while menstruating. This letter was written in the blood of Edinburgh body snatcher William Burke, which I will be discussing in further detail later in the presentation. The author of this note wrote it with blood taken from Burke's body during his post-mortem dissection and likely without his consent. Therefore, it can be classified as intentional and non-consensual. I have defined unintentional or accidental blood stains as occurring circumstantially without intent or purpose, such as objects stained with blood during military service. An example is a map of Belgium that was in the pocket of Julian Grenfell when he was wounded in battle in 1915 and is now heavily stained in his blood. The final consideration is whether the person from which the blood originated has been identified or not. From this information, we can avoid committing offenses under the Human Tissue Act and consult the individual or their relatives or community if they are deceased on how to most ethically handle their remains and respect their dignity. If you aren't already aware of who William Burke is, him and his partner in crime, William Hare, committed a series of murders in the early 19th century and sold the bodies to anatomist Robert Knox as a way to make money. Hare ended up ratting out Burke in order to save himself, and Burke was tried, pronounced guilty, executed, and then his body was publicly dissected. This note, which is supposedly written in his blood, is part of a scrapbook on Burke and Hare, held at the University of Edinburgh's Special Collections Archive. With this case study, we can start to look at visual clues as to whether this is blood. Firstly, the most obvious question is whether it's the color we would expect aged blood to look like, and yes, it's that brownish red we would expect from blood that's almost 200 years old. The next thing that I thought about was that William Burke was hung on the 28th of January, and he was publicly dissected on the 1st of February, so there's a bit of time between his death and dissection. After a body has died and the heart is no longer functioning, blood isn't being pumped throughout the body anymore, so all the cells in the blood will begin to settle, causing a purple-reddish discoloration known as hypostasis or postmortem lividity. This is also why blood doesn't squirt and spill out everywhere during a postmortem dissection. The blood that is oozing out is usually doing so because of gravity. So basically you can't just dip your pen nib into a body and write with it. Whoever wrote this likely had to collect the blood and water it down to make it fluid enough to write with. We can see quite clearly that this note is not written very neatly, which is expected of somebody writing with blood. If we go back to the Buddhist blood manuscripts, these monks have to prepare for quite a while to perform that ritual, and many factors are taken into consideration to make their blood more easy to write with. They're on special diets for months, the weather and altitudes affect the flow and drying times, and it's really not a simple process. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to write with blood that has been sitting and settling in a body for a couple days. Some letters have been written multiple times, particularly evident in this E here, and the first sentence looks quite a bit darker from the rest, as if whoever wrote this maybe didn't add enough water to start off with, and then began adding more water to increase the flow. The ER in murder is also quite a bit darker than the rest of the word, and we can see where the writer had to replenish their nib to make the latter part of the word legible. Another hint that this is indeed watered down blood is the prominent coffee stain effect I discussed earlier, as well as that yellowish color in thinner applications that is indicative of blood with a lower red blood cell count. There is also cracking occurring in areas that have thicker deposits of blood, such as on the capital T, and we can see a slight halo of yellow along the edge. For my part, I do think it shows enough visual evidence of being written in blood. So if it were my call, I would opt to conduct a test using the hexagon OBTI on it. That way we can determine whether it is indeed human blood. However, because it is held in an archive with strict minimal intervention policies, it's not likely that this could happen. XRF has been done on this, and it did confirm the presence of iron in the writing, but for reasons I mentioned earlier, that doesn't really give us much information. So in summary, blood is definitely not a common material that we'll be coming across in our practices as paper conservators. However, there are examples of historic paper objects that contain blood, and there's a rise in modern artists using blood in their work. It is therefore important that we are aware of options available to us to test suspected bloodstains and to make sure that we handle these objects with appropriate consideration and in ways that respect the dignity of the person that shed the blood on these objects. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that. It's interesting, actually, because the last two talks are both unconventional things on paper. So I'd like to segue into our final speaker of tonight, Laura Esser. Laura is a master's graduate from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She studied tangible heritage conservation, focusing especially on book and paper conservation. Laura is passionate about research and documentation of objects. Her goal is to work in an institution where she can combine her love for conservation and research. So that being said, we'll just stop her video and let her take it away.
Hello everyone, my name is Laura Esser, and today I want to talk to you a bit about my master's dissertation, which is titled The Impermanence of Fading Smoke, a conservation case study of Diane Victor's soot drawings. So first I'm going to talk about Diane Victor and her drawings, then I'm going to dig into her technique, then let you know the findings of the artist interview, which formed the main section of my dissertation, talk about the notion of artist intent, and then also talk to you about the visual documentation that I did. So Diane Victor herself is a very renowned and well-known contemporary South African artist, and she's mostly known for her etchings and prints, commenting on social injustices in the South African socio-political context, especially on war, corruption, South African legacies of colonization and segregation. So Diane started experimenting with candle smoke on paper in the early 2000s with an initial project depicting the fragility of people living with HIV in Grahamstown, the Eastern Cape. But here you also can see two of her different soot drawings that she has done over the year. I feel they are very beautiful and they look so mystical and magical. Since that project in Grahamstown, she has repeatedly used and perfected the technique and widened the scope of her themes as well to include capturing portraits of those who have been wronged by society, people who are physiological and emotionally unstable, and also, you know, animal injustices like the drawing you see to your left, the extinguished rhino II. So her works have really been exhibited worldwide, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, USA, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, UK, as well as the Ezeco Museum here in Cape Town, South Africa. So about her technique or creation process, she usually first starts with a pencil outline to kind of get the proportions right, and then she works upside down, like you can see on the picture on the left, on the board, or she hangs the work from the ceiling, really depending on the size of the artwork. And then once she's done, she reworks the image using a really soft makeup brush. And this way she adds detail by removing some of the soot, and she can also get rid of any harsh lines. And a portrait, like you can see on the pictures there, would usually take her 20 to 30 minutes to create. So the smoke drawings, really the most important thing for Diane Victor is the symbolism of fragility and the vulnerability of the medium. That connection is just so incredibly important to Diane Victor. And as I said before, most topics also cover or represent this fragility. And as increasing numbers of her works have been accessioned into collections worldwide, there's really been a demand in making the medium or making the artworks a bit more durable and last longer. And so she has mentioned that she is very interested in increasing the lifespan of her artworks, so that also the art would become available for future generations. And she has herself tried out various methods to extend the longevity of her artworks. However, these techniques usually don't preserve the actual artwork, but rather the appearance of the technique. So for example, spray fixatives, they alter the surface color from a warm brown tones to kind of a gray, and they also add texture, which is not what Diane Victor wants. She says it makes the artworks look rather flat, and she really doesn't like what they do to the art. So as for now, Diane Victor really prefers to not treat these soot drawings at all. And yeah, which is important because the fragility of the media still mirrors the meaning of the fragility of a chosen subject matter. Obviously, she mentioned that if she were to find a way to increase the longevity, she would then also alter the meaning, because the fragility aspect would obviously fall away. So like I said, they're extremely, extremely fragile, and they are also easily damaged during transport, exhibition, handling, and storage. They're easily smudged if you touch them. I mean, the soot easily just goes onto your hands, and vibration also just kind of can take away some of the particles. You can't store them on top of each other, you can't roll them. So yeah, it is a very difficult medium in that sense as well. Here also just two other artists that also experiment with smoke. There's, yeah, Diane Victor, she's not the only one. There are quite a few artists worldwide. One is Lee Bontekoe, and she's done it for a very long time. And then the other one is Steven Spazuk, and he's also a contemporary artist. Both of these don't only experiment with soot on paper, but also add other media, including charcoal or even paint, and also don't only do it on paper, which I think that's very specific to Diane Victor, that she really started with paper. She has tried out some other media like stone, for example, or glass, but paper is her main medium if it comes to the soot drawings. So the main part of my dissertation was the artist interview. Its intent was to record Diane Victor's feeling and also the artist's intent, her work process, material use, and conservation treatments. For example, she prefers to repair damage to the soot artworks herself, the soot, because she has the muscle memory to do so and doesn't mind doing this at all. But for any damage to the actual paper, she would really prefer to have a trained paper conservator repair that type of damage, and she doesn't have the knowledge. And obviously, if one of her works is too far away for her to just come and repair it, she would always be open to chat to a trained conservator for them to be able to replicate her technique. And then Diane Victor has expressed her wishes to find a way to make the soot drawings last longer, which is an avenue for future research. And she has also really in depth talked about her different materials that she has used and different techniques that she has used to extend the longevity. And yeah, she has really said the two things that she's not happy with is when something changes the texture and the color of these soot drawings. The interview also brought up the idea of an expiration date, because when Diane Victor originally started making the soot drawings, she never intended for them to last forever. She states that she intended that they initially should be, well, after the exhibition, they should be destroyed. She never actually wanted institutions, museums, or art galleries to buy them from her. And this money exchange usually added a market value to these drawings, which is an issue for her, but at the same time is what she needs, because she obviously needs to have an income to be able to continue making these artworks, which was very interesting, a very interesting take from the interview. And then lastly, about my visual documentation. Here you can see I did some digital microscopy and scanning electron microscopy to really just get an understanding of the relationship between paper or paper fibers and the candle soot. And for this, she actually, as you can see here on the right, she gave me 2 samples that she made for me to work with. And she really said you can try and smudge them, you can apply fixatives, you can cut out samples for the scanning electron microscopy. So she made 2, one that was a bit darker, which was this one, and then one which was a little bit lighter. And she also urged me to create my own soot drawings on different types of paper to really get an understanding. And it really helped to be able to kind of see the soot structures and how they really just sit on top of the first few top paper fibers. It was extremely interesting, and I was so grateful that she gave me the opportunity to work so closely with 2 samples that she made for me that are just like her actual soot drawings. And this is already the end of this very short discussion on this very interesting and exciting topic. I hope you enjoyed my talk. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available now after the talk and also via email. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. Well, that was fantastic. Yeah, to have to be able to work so closely with a living artist and their work, and really get into understanding their process. That's what a privilege. That was such an interesting project. So we will now open up the floor to any questions that you might have, either for Heidi or for Laura. But again, because I'm in charge, I get to ask my questions first. So Laura, I wanted to ask you, does the artist use particular papers? Do they use one type consistently that they prefer, or do they find that they can use a different mix of papers for their artworks?
Yes, so they prefer hot press paper. Diane says the smoother the paper, the smoke kind of rolls over the paper fibers, and that basically brings her desired look for her drawings. It's actually quite fun. Initially, she started out, she was teaching. She's actually still part-time lecturer at our university, which is super exciting. And she was teaching, working with mediums that are not as commonly used. And she was, she was teaching this method to a student who wasn't really interested in it. And then, she tried it and she kind of liked it. And that first exhibition that she did in Grahamstown about people living with HIV/AIDS, she did on normal cartridge paper, like printing paper, because that's what she had access to at the time. But ever since, she's tried out really a lot, and she says the smoother the paper, the better. She works on she has different sizes. So the hot press paper here in South Africa, we don't really have really oversized hot press paper available. So she uses Fabriano for that one. But she says when she was in the US, she went to the paper stores and they had just such a larger variety of papers. So she would just really like feel the texture and the surface of the papers and then go from there. And she's obviously still experimenting with it. And, if something new comes into the country that she might use, then she's always open, to really improve herself and her technique.
Yeah, fascinating. I find that whole side, I'm not artistic myself, so getting inside an artist's mind and seeing how they get a certain feel for different materials and their understanding is just, it's really, really interesting. Heidi, I also wanted to ask you, so if we were to consider blood to be human remains and therefore be under the Human Tissue Act protection, how does that implicate the display and handling of these objects? Is that something that would then fall under the jurisdiction of a human remains conservator, or would paper conservators still be responsible?
I think as paper conservators, we would still be responsible. There's very few specialists who are like solely human remains conservators. But the act there's like a limit. So it's like for public display, I think it's 100 years or something where you don't need consent. I'd have to look it up again. But it's mostly just making sure that if it is under that 100 years, we do get the consent of either the artist who is using the blood and displaying it or next of kin.
Interesting. And also as well, is there scope to be able to trace the DNA of the person if we weren't to necessarily know who contributed their blood? Is there the technology to be able to then go through and find ancestors or descendants, I suppose, of those people?
Yeah, so within blood, the DNA is stored within white blood cells. So as long as those haven't degraded, then you can technically extract them. If they have DNA in some sort of like larger database, or if you can take DNA from somebody who's like a living relative who you think is related, then you'd be able to see if you can match those DNA sequences. But that is very pricey. And I think it would probably not happen unless it's a very high profile case.
Yeah, sure. And Laura, I was wondering, so something that I thought was really interesting in your talk is that you mentioned that the artist stipulated that color change was a very big concern for them. But obviously, if we were to use consolidants, then they have obviously an impact on the refractive index of the artworks. So when you did your tests, did you find that there was a big change when you use consolidants?
Absolutely. And my dissertation unfortunately, it was beyond the scope to really go into more experiments and more detail, but I'd love to do that in the future and connect with fellow conservators who've maybe worked with fragile media before. But I've really, Diane, she said in our interview that it changes from warm brown colors to a dull gray. And that's really also what I found with the visual documentation that I did. The art, it kind of appears flat. It loses, its feeling, and it really changes. And then when I did the documentation with the digital microscope and also the SEM, it was really interesting to see how, the fixative, it formed kind of blobs, and it, I don't know, I guess you could say it kind of melted these carbon or soot structures away. So yeah, I don't know if there is a solution. Probably, I don't know, maybe there is. I definitely love to experiment further, and Diane is certainly open for it as well. So yeah, it's an ongoing project, definitely.
That's so exciting. Well, I hope we get an update about where that goes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a question for you, Heidi, from Kiri. Do you need a certain size of sample taken? I'm assuming it's quite difficult to get much of a sample, especially if the application is quite thin.
Yeah, so depending on which type of test you're using, the sample size is going to be different. A lot of the presumptive tests have like ridiculously high sensitivity, so you can there's a lot of studies done on how much they can basically dilute the blood before it becomes insensitive to the blood. So I think a lot of them is just kind of taking this little cotton swab of ethanol and just kind of brushing it over just a little bit. You wouldn't need to actually extract a piece or a sample like you would with doing spectroscopy or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's a really cool study where they were actually able to use eraser bits to test what kind of material was in a birthing girdle. So I would definitely recommend looking that up if you're able to.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think I remember that article is really, really good. There's a question for you, Laura, from Emma. Hi, Laura, so nice to see you. Wonderful talk. Did you experiment with suitable methods of display and transportation for these artworks?
Oh, hi, Emma. I know Emma. So nice to see you here. So I didn't experiment with it, but Diane said that her preferred method is box framing, because it essentially just cases the artwork in, and it is the safest way to, transport, exhibit, and display the artworks. So she float mounts the artwork with key hinges in the box frame, and she has one specific framer that she works with, because she says she needs someone that's experienced with this type of artworks, because she says she's worked with people before, and then she told them, okay, but please don't touch the soot because it will come off, and then they're like, yeah, and while framing the artwork, they touch it and you see it immediately. So she says it is the biggest thing that keeps her from immediately box framing her artworks is finances. It's extremely pricey. So she always advises people to please box frame it, but obviously she can only influence a buyer that much. Yeah, so I didn't experiment. I did my own soot samples. So Diane, she really encouraged me to, do my own soot samples and just try different papers, try different candles, which I did. And, I shook them and obviously smudged and everything. But yeah, I didn't experiment myself with any types of transport or framing.
Great. Yeah, there seems like there's so much still to find out about these soot drawings. Yeah. There's actually another question for you, Laura, from Zaffer, who said, do you have any method or idea in mind of how to preserve them?
I have a few ideas, and you know, I'd like to try out a few more things. Diane herself, she has really worked, like she's tried a lot. She does a lot of etchings and lithographs as well. So she's worked with people in that field to try to like kind of transform the soot drawing onto a different medium, but it's always left the artwork looking flat. And then what we've tried, well, we've really, with COVID and everything, the lockdowns happening, we were also constricted with time a little bit. So we've tried just commercial fixatives that are available in an art supply store, which left these big blobs. So my supervisors and I were thinking maybe if we could get or reduce the particle size of the fixatives, maybe if that would make a difference, maybe using what do you call it, ultrasonic atomizer. You know, there's definitely, we need to play around and we need to see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I used for my project, I used an ultrasonic Mr. nebulizer thing for the first time, and yeah, it's really incredible how, again, it almost is like smoke. It like really kind of billows across the artwork, and you can control the flow of it as well, so you can kind of reduce it right down.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, I can imagine that would be quite an interesting thing to explore, but still, it's still pushing something across the surface. So I don't,
Yes, essentially. So yeah, it's essentially seeing if it'll lessen the effect of the change in color and texture. But yeah, it's definitely something we'll have to just play around with and see what happens.
Yeah, interesting. Heidi, I also have another question for you. I was thinking, does blood on paper have any particular condition concerns? Does it, you know, I saw under those images that you put up of Burke's blood, particularly in the thicker portion, it seemed quite cracked. Is that something that could, you know, be an issue for its conservation?
Yeah, it would definitely, if you had like a large deposit of blood, especially if it was going to be displayed, you might want to consider consolidating. If it's fresh blood and it hasn't, the hemoglobin hasn't like degraded into methemoglobin and hemochrome yet, you probably wouldn't want to put it in like an anoxic framing situation, because you'd be sucking all the oxygen out and just kind of turning it almost black. Yeah, that's kind of all I've really looked into so far. Honestly, I've been more focused on the identification.
Yeah, sure.
More than the conservation, to be honest.
Yeah, it would be interesting. And I'm assuming as well that it would be, well, water soluble, I suppose, because if the letter was made by watering down the blood when it had already dried down, then it probably means it would be quite responsive to moisture, right?
Yeah, and yeah, you'd kind of treat it, I guess, anything you would do if you got blood on your clothing, you would do the opposite. Yeah, it would be, in the future, maybe it would be really nice to kind of look into how blood degrades over time as far as like RH and exposure to light and stuff, to see like how it changes, but PhD maybe.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, amazing. Wow. So actually the two case studies present like are very interlinking in a lot of ways. Like there's still so much to do in both subjects, and very tricky to conserve and to be continued. Yeah, I will leave the Q&A and chat box open if anyone does have any further questions to ask. But while we're all still here and awake, I'm going to do a quick shameless plug for submissions for the next symposium. So our symposiums, they run twice a year. We'll do an autumn one and a spring one. So submissions for the next symposium is September. So there's a little bit of time, and we've also changed the criteria so that current students who feel like they are willing and able to apply are more than welcome to as well. Also, the next Icon Book and Paper Group event is the Rusty Staple, our virtual pub is open at lunchtime for a work along on the 28th of April. It's free to attend, and we'll also be joined by the Chief Executive of Icon, Sarah Crofts, and the Head of Membership, Michael Nels. So I would encourage everyone to come along, have a chat. You can ask any questions to them or just share the projects that you're working on. Yeah, okay. That was my plug portion of the of the thing. But I guess if there aren't any further questions, we will be sharing, this presentation's been recorded, and we'll be sharing it with the audience in case you do feel the need to revisit something, and also the contact information of all of the speakers tonight is available in case something does pop up. But I think that probably rounds out the evening. Thank you all so much for all of your talks. They were so fascinating and such a great variation. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope everyone had an enjoyable time. And yeah, I hope to see everyone at the next symposium. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.